Logan, guys. So today I wanted to take a look at Cataclysm, but specifically a few of the different forks of Cataclysm. Now, anyone who's played this game, I'm sure a lot of you have probably played Dark Days Ahead. This is definitely the biggest and most popular fork. Probably not that many people have actually tried the original Cataclysm. Actually, for me, I think I've played it like once, and I've not been able to get it working anytime since then. But basically, the original Cataclysm, it's pretty similar to, if you imagine what older Dark Days Ahead versions were like, if you ever played those. You can always load up some very early versions of Dark Days Ahead, and those will be quite similar to the early Cataclysm. But this was released around 2010, I believe, and the original idea was that it was an open world roguelike set after this titular Cataclysm, a sort of omni-crisis where practically every single apocalypse that was in popular sci-fi happened at once. But the game was more or less abandoned by its creator Wales and didn't really see any updates, any real updates since like 2012 or 2013. After that, the production was taken over, and eventually you had the big fork that is popular today, Dark Days Ahead. Now, Dark Days Ahead is the one most of you guys are going to be familiar with. It's the one I've played the most. Even now, I still mostly play Dark Days Ahead whenever I come back to Cataclysm. It's the most developed, it's the biggest, it's the most popular, and it's the one you get when you search for Cataclysm. The first result is always World of Warcraft Cataclysm, and the second result is always Dark Days Ahead. So, just starting off with Dark Days Ahead, but I'm also going to look at a few other popular smaller forks as well, mainly the fork Bright Nights, Cataclysm Bright Nights, which is kind of like the second biggest, I would say, currently right now. And then another newer fork, which is The Last Generation, which is one I haven't been that familiar with. I only recently tried it out a little bit. I tried a few short runs with it, and I also recorded a little bit for this video as well. I recorded some footage for each of these forks for the video, just to kind of show off a little bit, but basically they're all Cataclysm. They all look more or less the same, so I'll kind of go over what my own thoughts about each fork was and where the differences I thought were and what other people thought as well. So starting off with Dark Days Ahead, this was started off initially to kind of continue the development of Cataclysm. Cataclysm was a popular game, but again, it was very niche and it wasn't being supported anymore. So it was taken over by specifically Kevin Grand and a few other core team members who've been continuing with it. And especially since 2019, they have been really focused on their own vision for what Dark Days Ahead should be. And that's, been a bit controversial with a lot of people, I think. But, whether you agree with that or disagree with that, for me, I don't really care. I'm not concerned about Reddit drama or like Discord drama, so I don't worry about that too much if the developers are being rude to people or not. I don't really care as long as the game is still enjoyable. But either way, let's talk about Dark Days Ahead. So it has changed a lot over the years, starting off from being obviously very similar to the original Cataclysm, which was very fantastic in its style. It was very much a sci-fi game. It did have zombies, of course, but the zombies were just like a background thing. It wasn't necessarily a zombie survival game, like, for example, Zomboid. Zomboid is always compared with Cataclysm, but it used to be very different. It used to be like this sort of suburban sci-fi, almost like cyberpunk setting. I would say cyberpunk, except it's not as like dark and gritty in terms of the surface world that people lived in. It's very much similar to a modern American society, except with a lot of advanced technology. You can imagine almost like the pre-war eras in Fallout, for example, if you want to imagine what that would look like, sort of the suburban sci-fi kind of universe. And it's changed drastically over the years. A lot of this near future stuff, the more crazy sci-fi elements are still there, but they've been moved very far into the background, or even in some cases removed. A big change was the setting was actually moved from being into the near future to being basically today plus a few years. So currently in DDA, the setting is basically just modern day, and any kind of sci-fi stuff is purely external. It's not from our world. A lot of people dislike these changes as well as others, but to be honest, in my opinion, I think DDA is still an excellent game. It has its own unique focus, and it's really focused on having slow character development, the more hardcore survival simulation, and a lot of these bizarre mysteries you can dig up if you really want to put the effort in to find them. And again, the big idea behind Dark Days Ahead, I think, is that it's slow. It's about slow development, building up bit by bit, building your base, building your kind of mobile fortress, if you want to do that, or building up your character and so on. So you can still do a lot in DDA, but it's very slow and grindy. And some people like that, some people don't. Definitely it sucks if you die and then you lose like a huge investment in your character, which is one criticism I will put towards DDA. Being a permadeath roguelike, ostensibly still a roguelike game, any games like that where you have to grind a lot to be able to get to any kind of like enjoyable point in the game, I find can be very exhausting to play. So sometimes DDA is pretty exhausting. After a long game and I end up dying, I feel like I don't want to play it for quite a long time. So that's one criticism I will put towards it. I still probably play DDA more than any other fork, and I've not really cared that much about the recent changes. I actually like the realism in the low sci-fi setting. It is pretty interesting, and it makes a lot of the technology and things you find a little bit more meaningful, though I do wish some of it was a little bit more out in the open. It doesn't mean you have to have the powerful stuff just out there everywhere. Like, you don't have to have just mutant gin lying around, but at least if it was something that you didn't have to get to basically the end game to even see any of it, it would be a little bit better, but, you know, whatever. Considering that DDA is an open source game, I don't really feel that much bad blood towards the game itself. I think people shouldn't really avoid it for that reason. You know, it's open source, so basically you can make your own fork whenever you want. Like, if I really wanted to, I can make a fork of DDA and just get an old version of DDA and host that as a new fork, you know? So it's not really a big issue. If you like old DDA, just play it. But also there's a lot of alternative forks out there that are getting new development, and I think these are good options for people who maybe they don't like the style of DDA, or they have problems with the development team, and, you know, that's understandable too. DDA itself is also split into the experimental and stable branches, which, while still the same game, experimental is constantly being updated with newest features, and sometimes they might be even years ahead of what you get in stable. So if you want like the newest stuff and a lot of changes and more active changes, definitely try experimental, but really it doesn't matter too much. Like I said, DDA is obviously kind of like the default, but again, I would probably go with it. You shouldn't think of it as like the one you have to play. I would go with it if you like a slow, methodical experience, building up your character, being very careful, more focused on survival within the world rather than heavy kind of like combat and destroying everybody around you. Now let's move on to something which is almost like the polar opposite of DDA, which is Bright Nights. Now, this is definitely the most popular fork aside from DDA, because DDA itself is a fork, and it really seeks to recreate the gameplay and feel of earlier versions of DDA as well as OG Cataclysm. Like I said, I think I've only played the original Cataclysm once, but I have played older versions of DDA, and I did reload some of them recently as well. And definitely Cataclysm Bright Nights really matches the feeling of these old versions. It's much faster paced. When I was playing this game, a match of this recently, I was able to kind of get going much faster than in DDA for sure. It's much more fantastic and has a more sci-fi direction rather than the very light sci-fi of DDA. The bionics play a big role, as do mutations. They're much easier to acquire and easier to install. Overall, it's a much more streamlined and I would argue easier experience, especially for a new player or those who want to play Cataclysm more like a traditional RPG rather than this kind of grindy survival sim. A big feature of the game is the electrical system being far simpler. You don't need these complex wiring setups, making machinery and base building much easier without really needing like vehicles or all this like preparation in advance. I find this version to be much more gameplay forward and very forgiving to play. Much easier to build a high level character and engage with all the game systems. Overall, it does have less content than DDA because it's a younger project and it doesn't have the same amount of development going into it. But also, one thing I really like about it and that I've seen the developers focus on is being mod friendly. And if you download the version from GitHub, it will come with a lot of mods included with it, which are all excellent. And they really try to focus on making Bright Nights very open for modders and very easy for modders to use their game, which I tend to like a lot because DDA seems to have been moving in the direction of being almost like anti-modding recently. I find they've been kind of like outmoding a lot of mods and being a little bit hostile towards modders. So I don't really like that about the DDA development. So I do like that Bright Nights is taking the opposite approach and being very open for modders. So this is a great option if you want to basically install a lot of mods, and a lot of the most popular Cataclysm mods like Cataclysm, Aftershock are also available for Bright Nights. Personally, while I tend to prefer DDA, I really do like the action-focused style of Bright Nights, which tends to feel a little bit more like a traditional roguelike rather than a full-on survival sim. Losing here, if I lose a game here, it doesn't feel like as much of a blow, and it's a lot easier to get back up again and try, as opposed to DDA, where losing a really well-developed character often can kill like my motivation to continue. It's a lot less concerned about the deeper simulation elements, so things like your nutrition, your vitamin intake, your temperature matter a lot less. Again, it's a lot like other roguelites where your first priority of combat, exploration, and looting, and things like eating are just like a pretty minor concern. I haven't played Bright Nights in a while, so I decided to actually load up a game and get a fresh experience. First off, I made a mutant to start off with. Not really a bad beginning, but starting in the woods is a bit boring at first. I think probably would have been better to start as a cyborg, since Bright Nights is a big focus on the cybernetics, and you can start off as a pretty powerful cyborg at the beginning. I wandered around for a little while, just looking for some easy sites to raid. After exploring the region, I found 2 abandoned hazardous waste depositories. I broke into each of them to loot, and I found some CBMs, but pretty low-level ones, specifically and a location cybernetic for like mapping the area. I also picked up some basic gear and just a pipe to use a weapon. I wanted to see if I can get a lot of radiation, but I didn't see any mutation effects or other negatives, so maybe I didn't really get enough. I found some mansions around the area, so I decided to do a mansion raid. I baited a few of these zombies out of the house to make for an easy entrance. I also killed a SWAT zombie and took his armor and his gun. One thing I found the combat, I mentioned before, but the combat in Bright Nights I feel is a lot easier. I mean, even just with a random pipe, I really didn't have much of a problem fighting a lot of these zombies, and I was able to like kill them pretty quickly. Even like a SWAT zombie, I feel like indeed if I saw a SWAT zombie and I wasn't like really kitted out, I would probably die from it, or I'd probably get killed, but I didn't have too much of a problem fighting a few basic kind of zombies. And I did get a gun from the SWAT zombie, and I used the ammo basically to target practice, so I basically used all the ammo on one singular zombie, killed it, and then dumped the gun. But you know, you shouldn't bother hoarding ammo. I think you should use it as soon as you get it, because it will only help your gun skills, and this is true in Dark Days Ahead as well. Whenever I find a gun, I just start using it immediately, because it's the only way you can train your rifle skill or your gun skills. You're not going to train it just by doing nothing unless you find some very lucky books. So I explored and slowly cleared out the mansion. Not too many issues, and I never really found myself stressing out that much in combat. Just kind of basic combat awareness and being careful. I also found a no daichi, a kind of Japanese sword, which made fighting a lot of the basics basically trivial. I was basically able to one-shot most of them, and even small groups I could easily take them out. I basically slaughtered everyone in the mansion, and overall it was a really easy starting experience. It didn't take me long to get my character up to the level where I could pretty much very easily fight basic enemies, even in like small groups, and explore without too much fear. If I'd played longer, I'd probably try to raid a few other mansions around the nearby town I was kind of following around, and see if they have any kind of useful gear. Some of these mansions have like really nice stuff in them. They might have some tech or some interesting things there, so it's always worth to raid mansions, especially early game, because they're not too difficult to deal with compared to like raiding a city or something like that. And maybe even find a hospital or a clinic to install some of my CBMs. Alternatively, I like to maybe try mutation maxing by swimming around more in the sludge or looking for some mutagen and try out the mutation system a little bit more here versus CDDA. Overall, pretty fun experience, much lighter and more streamlined overall. Now moving on to Cataclysm: The Lost Generation. This is one of the newest forks of DDA. It released in, I believe, 2024, and it has gained a lot of notoriety in the Cataclysm community since then. I've heard a lot about it. I haven't tried it basically till recently when I was trying out this for this video. I played it a few times. I also played it a bit last month when I was on holiday, but it's pretty interesting. The lead developer, Wormgirl, is very active and engaged with the players, which is pretty refreshing considering how antagonistic the DDA development core team can be at times. Even though I said I don't care about like Reddit drama, I am at least aware of it, so I do know that they tend to start a lot of shit, basically, or they get involved in a lot of shit, which is not good for any kind of development. The Lost Generation is a pretty interesting project. It's one I've been looking into a little bit, and definitely the sci-fi elements and action of Bright Nights are cool. I think ultimately I still kind of prefer the slower based survival experience of DDA in general. I think the goal, from what I heard from Wormgirl and from what I've seen, from what I heard from her posts, is The Lost Generation seeks to kind of marry these elements together and reimagine a modern survivalist simulator style of DDA, but maintaining the older kind of high-tech level setting of previous versions. So that's a very interesting concept. I do like that idea a lot because, I mean, having the unique setting is very cool and makes Cataclysm stand out as a game rather than feeling like it's, I don't know, I feel like DDA recently has really been in the shadow of Zomboid, and it almost seems to me that the development team has been chasing the success and the popularity of Zomboid a little bit rather than really leveraging what makes Cataclysm unique compared to Zomboid. Because for me, I mean, I like Zomboid, but I don't care about the generic zombie setting that much. I mean, I don't know, like I just don't care about that kind of setting. It's just kind of like boring. Definitely Zomboid is a game where I find I get bored pretty quickly from it. But definitely Cataclysm is a very cool, very unique setting. The sci-fi, kind of, like I said, the suburban sci-fi setting, and that's a term that actually I heard Wormgirl mention, which I really agree with and I really like. I think that setting is very cool, and I wish they would leverage it more. So I'm glad that The Lost Generation does seek to move more into that while keeping the kind of slower paced, realistic gameplay of DDA. In many ways, it seems a little bit harder than DDA and a little bit more focused on the survival experience. But again, I've only played it a little bit, so I can't really say for sure. That's just from my experience and from what I've heard other people say as well. It also has a little bit more of a story focus. The lore is actually built into the world, especially the older lore where the game is set in the near future. This kind of cyberpunk or, again, suburban sci-fi world. It's a good experience for people like me who do like the survival hardcore sim, but want to enjoy the kind of like quirky aspects of the older sci-fi DDA, and don't really like how a lot of it is so hidden way behind these lengthy quest lines and specific faction interactions. For example, if you want to get into a lot of the really high-tech sci-fi stuff in DDA, you have to go through a lot of these quest lines involving the Hub, which is a faction of scientists, or the Exodi, which are this faction of interdimensional humans. And you have to do a lot of this stuff, which, you know, again, that's all late game stuff. That's all like after a lot of work. And I think a lot of people who play Cataclysm might just never see it. And maybe some of you guys have never even seen an Exodi or been to a hub facility or anything like that. And for me, I rarely even see them. So like, it's something that you don't really get to interact with that much. It doesn't have as much mod support compared to DDA and Bright Nights, and it's more focused on a very specific vision led by a singular dev. Now, this version of Cataclysm is pretty new to me. I've only really played it recently, and I did find it pretty distinct, so I wanted to talk about it. I found the survival crafting sim to be very similar to DDA. I didn't notice that much difference personally. I heard this is based off of a more recent version of DDA, so it does have a lot more similarities than Bright Nights. Bright Nights feels very different compared to DDA because it's based off a much older version. The world and enemies are definitely way more dangerous than Bright Nights. In Bright Nights, like, I started off a game in the exact same settings as here. I started off as like a mutant in the middle of a field, and while in Bright Nights, I really like didn't feel like pressured at all. I was going around killing people, raiding mansions. I was beating people with a pipe and like having not really any issues. Meanwhile here, I actually died a few times starting off, being a little bit too aggressive. So once I had to pull back and be a bit more slow-paced and passive like it would be in DDA, I did have a bit more success. I find the useful items, like high-tech things, are still quite rare. It's not like you can just walk around and find some amazing sci-fi thing just lying around, but at least the world it does have these things there. It's something you can find if you look, but it's not like just sitting out in the open. It's definitely not as much as Bright Nights, where you do find just like CBMs in a random like building factory somewhere without any security. Of course, the high-tech and fantastic elements are also more common, making some encounters a bit more dangerous, but also increasing possible loot rewards for a successful raid. For example, I found actually a lab pretty early on and was able to raid it for some supplies. Not nearly as scary as the DDA labs because I was able to run around without like getting overwhelmed, but I still had to run away from some powerful enemies. There's a lot of carryover from DDA, but it's not as distinct as Bright Nights. I would kind of consider this a little bit of a middle ground between the two ideas, having the more distinct universe of Bright Nights, but being more grounded, similar to DDA. Just going over my final kind of opinions. While I've played all these versions, ultimately I still find myself going back to DDA more often than anything else. While the devs may slap you in the face pretty often, they also tend to leave a ton of new content as well with every update. I also do like to dip into Bright Nights every so often as well, as it's a more faster paced experience and you're able to run it more like you would any other kind of open world roguelike as a more pure gameplay experience. It's fun, especially since you have more options to engage with the higher level stuff, but it's a big departure in my opinion from the slow-paced and more intentional gameplay of DDA. As for The Last Generation, I've only really recently become aware of it, but I found playing it to be a pretty interesting experience. However, I'm unsure if I'd choose it over the gritty DDA or the more light Bright Nights. I'd recommend to someone who still wants to keep the survivalism of DDA, but in a more fantastic sci-fi setting. As mentioned, I generally prefer the survivalist realism approach to Cataclysm gameplay, and this hits that as well as bringing in the more unique and exciting aspects of Cataclysm's world, making it in many ways a deeper experience if one is not keen on loading up DDA with a ton of mods. If you've ever tried the No Hope mod for DDA, I would say The Last Generation is pretty similar to that sort of experience, and I look forward to seeing its development continue. Overall, however, while DDA is still often my first choice, the sunsetting of support for some mods and the constant, frankly bizarre changes sees me looking at alternatives more often. And of all of them, I would say Bright Nights probably is your best option if you want something really distinct from DDA that is still recognizably Cataclysm. The mod friendliness of Bright Nights only further makes it a really great choice, especially with something like Aftershock, which turns up the features and themes of Bright Nights even higher. As for The Last Generation, I'll keep my eye on its development to see what it turns into, as I think it's still not as distinct as DDA and Bright Nights, but I am kind of looking forward to see what happens with it. Alright guys, so that was kind of my thoughts on some of the main Cataclysm forks. I've also played some of the big popular mods as well. Maybe I'll do another video in the future talking about a few of them like Cataclysm, Aftershock, and some things like that. As for Aftershock specifically, that one is actually included with Bright Nights, and I find it works really well with Bright Nights. I really like playing Bright Nights with Aftershock on. It basically, as I said, it kind of turns everything up to 11. You know, it takes Bright Nights and makes the world really exciting, crazy, and really fast-paced. So if you want to really maximize that experience, I would say Bright Nights with Aftershock is a great option. But either way, guys, I'll see you again next time. So goodbye, guys. And remember, guys, if you like the kind of content I make here, remember to like the video and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out a lot. But either way, guys, I'll see you again next time. So goodbye, everyone.